Okay. All right, couple reminders about, or before we start this lab. One is, I'm not quite sure why people have decided to do this, but I have several people who seem to be taking more than one quiz. That doesn't help you. I'm going to take the first quiz that you did. So please don't take it multiple times. All it does is mean I have to go in and get rid of one of them. But I think people think first of all, they're not the same quiz. But they're very similar. When you have 3 labs, obviously I want them to be similar. So I'm going to get rid of your quizzes if you take extra ones, but it's a lot harder for me to keep track of that. So just please don't do it. All right. And the other reminder is, remember when you get your quiz grade, and we're kind of back. We had several where your grade didn't go up much, but now we're going to be doing models. And on those models, you're going to have to write in maybe what part that is. So expect that I go in after every quiz that everybody takes once they're all done, and I make sure that you didn't lose points for spelling or something like that. I say lose points for spelling, it's got to be close, but obviously things like capital letters, a space, something like that. So that is the idea with that. So once again, remember, you may see the grade go up a couple points after I've had an opportunity to do that. And also that means don't, like, if you sit there and you look at it and go, wow, I got a 5, I studied for that, I should have done better, da, da, da. You may have done better. You just got to be patient. Okay. Also, next week we have another quiz. This will be on tissues. And for next week, there is a food log that you need to prepare for the lab. And that food log is found in your lab book on page 121. So next week's lab is digestion. And in order to complete the assignment next week, you don't have to put it on here. If you want to put your food log on your phone, whatever, this is just to give you an idea of what you would need for information. You have to do a minimum of 2 days of food, and you're going to be asked to put it into what's called, it's myfitnesspal.com. Some of you may be familiar with it, but it's a diet analysis program. And there are very specific things that I am looking for the report. And if you look on page 120, okay, so 121 has the food log, 120 has the directions and what I'm looking for. So just to give you an idea, and if you want to get a head start, you are welcome to do this and have it done when you come into class. There's a form also under the lab for next week, under the digestion lab, so you can fill out either form. I think the one for next week, let me look real quick, because it might be the heck just happened? All right, hold on. I don't know. I'm guessing that my mouse just died. Hang on. I usually keep some. I won't be able to find them now. I think I keep some batteries on hand because this is a relatively routine thing. That looks better. Okay. Sorry about that. Let's see if that does what I want it to do. And I'm just looking really quick in the digestion lab to see if there's a fillable form for this. I thought I might have made one. Yes, there is a fillable form in there. So back out. So if you want to use, you're welcome to use this form that's in the book. It will be the same form, but then there's also a fillable form if you'd prefer to do that. So food log, that has to be done. And you can go ahead and do page 120, or from when I open up the next lab, you can use it there as well. All right, so if you want to hit start, feel free. Also, I guess I don't have to announce that. Anyway, so we're doing the tissues lab today, and the tissues lab begins on page 91. And one of the things I think you'll find with today's lab, this is there's a lot of information in it, and it's difficult. It's not difficult information that I'll be telling you. What it is it's difficult to remember all the information for next week. This will be a tough quiz. If you were face-to-face in the lab, you would be looking and using the microscope in the lab. You'd be drawing pictures of all these tissues. Suffice it to say that doesn't work well. But in addition to these tissues that we're going to talk about, the next problem is that we're doing 4 models today, and you're responsible for 4 models. So this, it's just a tough lab. The quiz will have 4 or 5 tissue types that you will have to identify. So my suggestion to you is, as you go through, there is areas throughout the lab that it says, let me see, where does it say it? For example, on page 96, there's a table, and it gives you an opportunity to write some sketches. If you would prefer, the back of the lab on page 108 also has area where you can write the sketches. So my suggestion to you is to use that to write sketches. Maybe it'll put it in your mind a little bit better. But in addition, you're going to be using the virtual scope for some. We don't have all of those options on the virtual scope. So you will get into the virtual scope, but when I talk about the assignment, you'll see that it might still be advantageous to have drawings of them. All right, so all that said, bear with me. All right, so I am on page, starting on page 91. I'm looking now at page 92. And what you need to understand about tissues is, if you think way, way back to the very beginning, very first week of class, we talked about the hierarchy of life, basically. And we started with atoms and molecules, which we know are not alive. And then we went to cells, which are living things. And then we moved on to tissues. So if you remember this kind of circular picture, that circular picture had tissues after cells. And what tissues are is a group of cells that work together for one function. So they perform one function. Now, if you think of your entire body, I can't remember what the number is, but I think there's close to 200 different functioning cells in your body. But they all fall into 4 categories of tissue. Okay, they may have a slightly different function depending on where they're located, but they still are going to be one of 4 types of tissue. So I am going to, well, let's look at 92. And the diagram on 92 gives you an idea of what all these different tissues look like. And the fact that they don't really look similar, right? They don't look similar. As you look at them, they all, well, there are some that look a little similar, but most of them have a different look. And that's what you have to focus on when you go through, because if I give you a picture on the quiz, you've got to be able to pick out certain features. So we'll do that as we go along. But I'm going to do that from a PowerPoint because I don't have, or I should say you don't have a microscope. I actually have one at home. Let's see. And so we're on lab 8. Let me share this with you and we'll get started. All right. First of all, I'm going to take you on a brief tour of the lab itself. Now, this was the very first one that we went online last year. So I mean, you keep hearing, well, it's been a year. Well, this was our first lab that was all completely online. So it's set up a little bit differently. I changed as I went along, but it looks a little bit different. Can you see this? Okay. So I don't know what I was thinking, but I even had a table of contents back then. So impressive, wasn't it? But the point is, this is the lab introduction. This is the PowerPoints I'm actually going to present to you today, except this is a narrated version. So if you were to have to go in, or you couldn't remember something and you wanted to go in, well, you could go into the Zoom recording, but also you could go in and review there. And then these are the 4 models that we're going to be talking about. And those are all video today. I don't have any of those models at home. So I will show you videos on those models. But then to try and make it a little bit easier, I've also picked out photos of the models. And what I've done is I have circled particular structures that I am going to talk about and that you should know. Okay, so when you're studying the models, these are the things that you should know on each model, the circled blue. All right, anyway, so there's those photos as well under the labeled model photos to help you study. And once again, we have our virtual microscope. And on the virtual microscope, you are going to look at all of these different types of tissues, but that is not a complete list like our back page is, just so you know. And all I ask you to do with the virtual microscope is to pick your favorite one. Okay, so you don't have to take pictures of every one of those, but go in and take a look at them and make sure that you could identify them on a quiz. So you're going to send me your virtual microscope assignment will be a single tissue. If you are dying to send 2, you can send 2 under the 40X objective. So that'll be one assignment. You'll have the summary questions as a second assignment. And then we have something a little different, but you'll see this come back in a couple weeks. This is called a video quiz. And the video quiz, it's only, I don't know why we call it a quiz, but it's not really a quiz. But what it is you watch a video, and while you are watching that video, you fill out, there's a fillable form in this case, or you can just print it out and write it in, either way. But let me move it on to the other screen.
Is that also due Sunday?
All of these are due Sunday. Okay, so they'll be due Sunday night at midnight. And so basically this is the fillable form, but you can, as I said, just print it out and write it in if you'd like. But these are all questions, or the answers are all found in that video, and they are in order. Okay, so if you need to stop the video and go back, you can. I'm not going to do that with you. There's no real good reason for me to do that with you, but that is also going to be due on Sunday. So this week you have 3 assignments due. One is going to be the virtual scope. Another one is going to be the summary questions. And the third one will be the muscle video quiz. And as you look through here, just like in everything so far, right, assignments are in pink. So you should be able to easily find them. This muscle video, this is the one that you'll be looking up. And when you go in, you're going to have to put in your JCC username and password. Okay, and that will let you through. This is through, whoops, that is through our, see if I can just do that. It is through our library. So your JCC password works and it will come up. And now the other thing I should tell you, I should make you read this on the bottom, but you can stop this after 14 minutes. Okay, you should have all your answers after 14 minutes. However, it is interesting. So if you want to continue watching it, you're welcome to, obviously, especially since I'm not going to be there to know whether you went beyond 14 minutes or not. All right, so there is what's going to be due next week. So let's move on then. And I'm going to try, oh no, I don't want to do that yet. Hang on. There we go. All right, so let's, I don't know why anyway. All right, so let's talk about tissues and histology. Histology is the word for examination under a microscope. Okay, so you're examining tissues, but underneath a microscope. So, and that's actually a field. If someone is interested in that, what the heck? This was doing this yesterday. I swear I didn't touch it. Okay. So histology is actually a field in medicine, and it relates to preparing tissues for examination under the microscope. And then there is somebody called a cytologist, and a cytologist, cyte means cell, and they are people who examine those tissues for abnormalities. But then there's a medical doctor who oversees this area, and he's called a pathologist. Okay, so there's actual areas in medicine where people work and they spend their time examining tissues. And you can imagine how important that is in cases like cancer, right? The examination of tissue. All right, so the 4 tissue types, remember I mentioned we have 4 tissue types. Those 4 tissue types are epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. Okay, and we've got variations in all of these except nervous. We're not going to, we're only going to look at one type. But let's start with epithelial tissue. And epithelial tissue has a job. And that job is to act as a barrier and to protect the tissues and the organs and the rest of you underneath it. All right, so epithelial act as a barrier. They also let me put it this way, they line the digestive tract, for example. And we know that the digestive tract is responsible for absorbing foods and liquids into the body. So it's also got to be able to allow things to pass. So not only is it a barrier in some places, but in other areas, it's got to allow things to pass back and forth. So epithelial tissue has a variety of jobs. What we're seeing here is skin. So you're actually seeing this skin is part of the integumentary system. It actually has its own system. The most notable organ associated with the integumentary system is the skin, but it also includes things like your nails and your hair. Those are part of your integument. So this is skin. And as far as the role of skin, that is protective. And so looking at this down on this bottom where there's a lighter pink and it meets the darker pink here, there's a membrane that runs along there, and that's called the basement membrane. And the cells actually attach to the basement membrane. So as we look at this, these are all cells. These are all cells. These are all cells. Okay, and if you look closely, you'll see in these different cells, that one's a perfect example. There's a nice nucleus. These are pretty round, right? They're pretty obvious. As we get up closer to the surface of the skin, we can see they flatten out. And so they flatten out. They're a little bit more irregular. We can still see the nucleus, but these are all keratinized. Keratin is a protein that's produced to act as a barrier to the surface of your skin, so that things like bacteria or dust particles or slivers of things and water don't gain access to the lower tissues. So keratin is a tough outer coating. And it's one of the reasons why you can get in a bathtub or a hot tub or go swimming without becoming waterlogged and going to the bottom, right? And that's because of this keratin coat protecting you. So we're seeing cells that are more organized down near the bottom. And as they get up closer to the top, they're going to become more irregular and they're going to become keratinized. But this is all epithelial tissue from the basement membrane all the way up to the surface. And this is actually called the epidermis. And we'll see that on the model, the epidermis. It's the upper layer of skin. Let's see. I am actually now really on page 94. And we're going to go through some different features of epithelial. And epithelial tissue comes in two types, two basic types. One is simple, and simple just means it's a single layer. That's all simple means. So simple means it's a single layer, and stratified is what we mean when we are talking about multiple layers. So we can have each of these types of epithelial cells. We have squamous epithelials, cuboidal epithelials, and columnar epithelials. And all of those can be found in the simple form, so as a single layer, or they can be found in the stratified form, which means that it's multiple layers. And these give you some examples of where you may find these different types of epithelial. So the squamous epithelial is a really irregular shaped epithelial. It doesn't have a set shape, it's flat, and you actually got to see squamous epithelial cells when we looked at the cheek cells. Remember when we did the microscope and I showed you cheek cells? And those cheek cells were kind of purple with a darker nucleus in them. And that was a squamous epithelial cell. And that they are flat and they're irregularly shaped. So when you take them off the cheek, for example, and put them on a slide, remember that those shapes were all different. And that is characteristic of squamous epithelial cells. So simple squamous epithelial cells would be one layer of those found at a surface, whereas stratified squamous would be multiple layers found at a surface. And then cuboidal, and cuboidal actually we see lining ducts, not DUCKS, but DUCTS, ducts, those things that are like hoses. And so we see those frequently in places like the kidney tubules or in different types of glands. We see them in sweat glands. And so we expect cuboidal, these kind of cube-shaped cells, to be found in that area. And those cube shapes, first of all, when you see them in a microscope or in the picture as I'm going to show you, remember that you are seeing things two-dimensionally, right? So it might be hard sometimes to imagine this shape. So you have to use your imagination as far as that goes. But those are more cube shaped. Notice how big the nucleus is in them. compared to the size of the cell and the shape of the cell. And then our last type is columnar. And columnar cells look like a column. So that means they are taller than they are wide. And we can see a variation depending on the type of cells we're looking at. We can actually see a variation in where the nucleus lines up. Sometimes the nuclei will line up all together at a single level. Other times they'll do this, where the nucleus in the cell is either above or below the one next to it, and it gives kind of a funny line. And sometimes that will make it difficult to tell whether you have a single layer, whether it's simple columnar or whether it's stratified columnar. Other things that you would find associated with columnar epithelials is this right here. And that is called a goblet cell. And the places where you find columnar epithelials are places where you would have a mucus layer on the surface. And goblet cells make the mucus and they secrete it onto the surface. So oftentimes when you're looking at a columnar layer, whether it be stratified or simple, you may see these goblet cells, and I'll show you what those look like. That would be a hint to you if you are looking at something on an exam. If you saw goblet cells, you would be looking at a columnar epithelium. The other thing I want to point out, and I do not know, I don't think these are supposed to be cilia. I think they're supposed to be villi on the surface, but both columnar, or the types of columnar, simple and stratified, are found in places like the digestive organs, right? So along the digestive tract, we see the presence of villi in those locations, and villi are a way that the cell can increase surface area. So we'll talk about that next week, and I think that's what this is showing, these little knobs at the top, but there's something else that we also see here. And that is, depending on the surface, we can see the presence of cilia. And cilia, remember from our cell structures, are little hair-like protrusions off the cell. And because we have mucus being secreted, you want to make sure that whatever's trapped in the mucus is then brought up. Okay, so when we think of the respiratory tract, for example, it's lined with mucus. That mucus is coming from the goblet cells in the layer, but in addition to that, we've got the cilia that then are going to, there's a boat going by. I'm sorry if you can hear it. It's pretty loud. It's an airboat. Anyway, the cilia is going to move that mucus up, and it's going to move it out of the lungs, and it's going to move it up to where the trachea is where air goes down into the lungs, right? It's where the esophagus, which is the tube that goes into the stomach, separates from the trachea. So it's going to go up to the top of the trachea, and it's going to dump that mucus down into the stomach. And that happens all the time. Cilia are responsible for that movement. All right. So these are the different types of epithelium. I will not ask you to identify a stratified epithelium. I would ask you to identify either a simple squamous epithelium, a simple cuboidal epithelium, or a simple columnar epithelium. Okay, so I won't ask you to try and decide whether there's multiple layers there or not. But this is an example of simple squamous epithelium. And what you're seeing is the lighter area is the cell, the cytoplasm, and the darker area here is the nucleus. And so if you look down through here, they're irregularly shaped, but you're also seeing that they're very narrow. This is a single layer. This is found in the alveoli, and the alveoli is a sac that holds air in the lung. And so we want our air sacs in the lungs. They actually look kind of like grapes when they're, so if you breathe in, these alveoli kind of enlarge with air, sort of like a balloon, but they look sort of like grapes. All right, so that's what you're seeing here. And so this is air, and then this would be the cell. You want very narrow line of cells. So a simple squamous epithelium, you want that to be very narrow because you have to exchange CO2 and oxygen there. So you want to make sure that you can exchange that easily. So you have a very narrow group of cells. And in this case, it's going to be simple squamous epithelium. Over here on the right, you can see these are epithelium also, but they don't look much like our simple squamous. These are cuboidal. And remember I said you're seeing it two-dimensionally, but what you're seeing here is a tubule. Sort of like, remember we saw the seminiferous tubules last week, and they were nice and round like this. So you're seeing the basement membrane of the tubule around the outside, and then these cells are attached to that basement membrane. And that attachment's important. We talked about cancer and how cells that don't attach well can move to other locations. So these cells are attached to this basement membrane and to one another. But these are cuboidal, and it's a little harder to picture that. All right, but those are cuboidal. It really isn't hard to tell squamous from cuboidal and columnar, but sometimes it's hard to tell the cuboidal and the columnar apart. So what you're looking at is the size of the nucleus related to the cell. And then you're also looking at the size of the cell. Is the cell taller than it is wide? So these are cuboidal cells, and it's hard to see in between it to see the cell membrane. Actually, it looks like you might be able to see if you look closely here. There's one side, there's the other side, and then this is the nucleus. So this lighter purple around the nucleus is the cytoplasm. So you're seeing individual cells. But then we have simple columnar epithelial, and notice that this is taller. Here is our basement membrane down along the bottom here, and all of these cells are attached to the basement membrane. You can see that we have the nucleus in the center, but these are pretty tall when compared to these simple cuboidal cells. What we also see here is that, any idea what that is? I currently cannot see the chat, so if anybody puts something in the chat, I'm not able to see it.
Goblet cell?
That is a goblet cell. There is a goblet cell, and it produces mucus, and oftentimes that's not going to stain real well. So sometimes it just looks like this. It just looks kind of like an empty area in this line of cells. So that's a goblet cell that produces mucus. So that would give you a hint that you might be dealing with columnar epithelial versus these cuboidal epithelials. All right, that finishes epithelial tissue. And the next tissue is called connective tissue. And connective tissue has a variety of different jobs because we have a variety of different connective tissues. And some of the jobs are going to be to hold our organs in place, for example. So separating the compartments in our bodies, connecting tissues, thus the connective tissue name, which would involve tendons and ligaments. You've heard of tendons and ligaments. Those are at your joints and they help support your bones and muscles. Bones are considered connective tissue, and we know that bones are important for us being able to stand up, right? And for our, obviously, to anchor our muscles. Fat is a connective tissue, so adipose is considered a connective tissue. And we actually, blood is a connective tissue. There is something that is in common in all of these, and that is they have both cells and what's called extracellular matrix. So that's a little bit different than we saw in the epithelial tissue where we just saw cells. So connective tissue is going to have cells in it, but it's going to have a lot of extracellular matrix. So let's see what those look like. I am actually now on page 97. And I don't think I go in quite the same order as the book, but let's see how I do here. So the first one is called loose areolar connective tissue. And looking at this, okay, we actually see cells, and there's something called, well, we like to get as confusing as possible when we name cells. So sometimes we call the last part of the word that describes the cell is cyte, C-Y-T-E, cyte. Other times it's a blast, all right? So fibroblast is the type of cell here that is making this tissue. So fibroblast is the cell. And you're also seeing in this labeled diagram that there is collagen fibers that are in this type of tissue, and there's elastin fibers here. So as we look, these darker stringy things are elastin, and the darker red are the collagen fibers. And a couple things to note about this. Elastin is what it sounds like. It's elastic tissue. So it has a little bit of give and springiness. But as we age, for example, and our skin starts becoming less taut and we get wrinkles, it's sort of like the elastic in your sweatband, right? Or your sweatpants. And after a while of use, it no longer stretches anymore. And that's what happens with the elastin fibers. So you're seeing loose areolar connective tissue. And notice kind of how there's not a really good structure to it, is there? And when you compare it to dense connective tissue on the right, you can see that the dense connective tissue also has all these collagen fibers. These pink things are collagen fibers again. And then we actually have, they're a lot harder to see because they're packed in. We have the fibroblasts, so we have the cells that make the collagen, and they're kind of packed in here. So you're seeing them not very well, basically, in comparison to the tissue. And this is dense connective tissue, and look how much more structured it is. So this would be the type of tissue that is going to hold your organs in place. All right, it's going to be under your skin. It's going to hold your organs in place. It's not real tough, and it's not required to be real tough. Its job is kind of to keep things together, make sure they don't go anywhere. But this is dense connective tissue, and that is much more organized and much stronger. And it has to be because that makes up the ligaments and tendons. Okay, and you know how much you count on ligaments and tendons. Wow. In your body for structural support of your knee, right? You know, if you've ever twisted your ankle or you have hurt your knee or your shoulder, how important those ligaments and tendons are in holding your limbs in place. This is actually cartilage, and you've probably heard of hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is what makes up the end of your nose, and it makes up your ear, right? Your ear is not bony, that is cartilage. And this has the matrix is this cartilage substance. But then we find our cell, and we're going to switch the name again on you, and that is a chondrocyte, and the chondrocyte makes hyaline cartilage. Here's the CYTE, that's going to tell us that it's the cell. And they actually have this little kind of divot here that the cell resides in, and that's called a lacuna, and a lacuna will come back. We'll see that again. So we have the matrix, which is the cartilage, with the cell embedded in this little area called the lacuna. And I remember this one. It's pretty characteristic to see. I remember this one because it reminds me of eyeballs. Okay, and it's really the only one that I would ask you that has this characteristic look. Also, I should go back for a second. I would ask you this on a quiz. I will not ask you dense connective tissue on a quiz. And you'll see when we get to a type of muscle, it's going to look very similar to this muscle. So I will, or to this connective tissue. So I wouldn't ask you the dense connective tissue, and there's another, I'll show you when we get there, of the muscle. This is adipose tissue, and adipose tissue is fat. And what you're seeing here that is not colored is actually a vessel, a cell containing fat. Remember that fat does not mix with water. And most of the dyes that we use when we're staining cells, because this isn't the natural color, we stain them to be able to see differences. And most of the dyes we use don't stain fat because they are water soluble dyes. So the fat will not pick up the color here. So it looks like this big empty space, but it's actually a fat-filled cell. Because it's fat-filled, we're going to see that there is areas where the nucleus gets pushed over to the side. So the nucleus we'll sometimes see as just a little bit more dense region along the side of one of these cells. So you're seeing the cytoplasmic membrane, right? And in this case, I think it looks like maybe that's on this side. This is a nucleus pulled up, pushed up against the side, and then this would be fat-filled. Okay, so any picture that I show you of this, the fat is going to look like these big empty cells. This is a blood vessel, and blood vessel supplies most of our tissues, sometimes really well and sometimes not. And we'll visit that a little bit more. This is really characteristic. This will be an easy one for you to identify because this is compact bone. We'll actually see a model of compact bone as well in a few minutes. But what you're seeing here is the basic structure of bone, and it's divided into these things. So kind of there's the diameter of one osteon. Okay, so this round thing here, and the distance from here down to here is called an osteon, and that's a unit of bone. Now, when we're talking about bone and compact bone, this is called compact bone, we're talking about these osteons, and we're talking about each osteon having a central canal. So the central canal actually houses blood supply, and it also houses a nerve. So you know if you've broken a bone, how painful that is. But you also know that when you go to the doctor says, well, in 4 to 6 weeks, it will be repaired. it will be repaired because of the blood supply that is present in all this bone. We don't really think of blood supply being so prevalent in bone, but it's in each one of these osteons we get blood supply. So that helps with repair. These are in concentric circles around the central canal. So the concentric circles, the stuff that makes up these concentric circles is called lamella. And lamella is made up, the matrix of the compact bone is calcium and phosphorus. It also has some collagen fibers in it. So there's a lot of things, mostly minerals, that go into making the matrix for the bone. Other things that we see here, okay, where are the cells? If this is all matrix, where are our cells? They are hidden in these little spots here. Those little spots are called lacuna. Sound familiar, right? So hyaline cartilage and the compact bone both have lacuna, and the lacuna hold on to the cell. So our bone making cells, osteocytes, are going to be housed in this lacuna. Okay, and you can see that they're all around here, but they can't go anywhere. They're pretty much trapped because of the matrix. We can also, there's little, they look like, I don't know, little wavy things coming out of the lacuna. And those are actually called canaliculi. And the canaliculi allow that trapped osteocyte, that cell, to communicate with other cells. All right, so that is compact bone. On the right-hand side, you're seeing something called spongy bone. I will not ask you spongy bone, but we're going to talk in a couple weeks about the musculoskeletal system. So I want to introduce some terms to you here. When we're looking at bone, we've already mentioned that there's compact bone, and I said this is spongy bone. This is a femur. Okay, this is the bone that goes from your hip, and this is going to be in your hip joint, and then this is going to be down at your knee. So this is our femur, and there's two parts to a long bone like your femur. One is called the epiphysis, and the epiphysis is going to be the ends. Okay, so it's going to be the end up here and the end down here. Whoop. That's called the epiphysis. The part that goes down through the center is the diaphysis. So the diaphysis actually is kind of interesting because the diaphysis is hollow and it's filled with this yellow marrow. Any of you who have a dog know that you get a marrow bone, right, for your dog, and it's usually of a cow, and it cuts off part of the femur and it allows the dog to eat the yellow marrow. Yellow marrow is fat. Okay, so yellow marrow is fat that's found all the way down through the diaphysis of a long bone. However, and notice too, while we're here, that all around the bone itself, the outer edges of the bone is made up of compact bone. And that compact bone encircles this yellow marrow down the diaphysis. So we have compact bone on the outside. That would look like this, and it's very strong. And then we have what's called spongy bone in the epiphysis. So down here, there would be spongy bone, and here there would be spongy bone. And instead of having yellow marrow in the spongy bone, we would have what's called red marrow. And red marrow is where we make our blood cells. Okay, so our red marrow is where we make new red blood cells to carry oxygen, and white blood cells right, to fight infection. So that would be found in the epiphysis of the bone. Something else to note here, although we call it spongy bone because it has that appearance, it's still bone tissue. So it's not like really like a sponge, but it gives more of an appearance of a sponge. And what that allows is in these spaces for blood to be formed. So we're looking at the this dark pink here is the bone, and it looks a little different than compact bone, doesn't it? Looks a little more like hyaline cartilage, but I would not ask this of you. So if you saw something that looked like, right, the eyeballs, it would be hyaline cartilage. But this is bone tissue, and the spaces are taken up with cells that are immature or maturing, I should say, blood cells. All right, that's what you're seeing there. And speaking of blood, this is, I think this is the last of our connective tissue. And blood seems odd to be a connective tissue because everything we've had so far has some sort of matrix, right? Extracellular medium of some sort. And yet here we look at different blood cells. This is a red blood cell, okay? The ones that look like donuts, those carry oxygen and CO2, and look how we have tons of them. And then we have white blood cells. This is a white blood cell. This is the same type of white blood cell. And then this is a third white blood cell, but it's a different type because we have multiple types of white blood cells. But white blood cells' job is to fight infection. So all three of these cells have the job to fight infection. And just to look briefly, we're seeing the cell. And this type of cell is a phagocytic cell. It's going to eat things. So that's its job, is to eat things. So this is called a neutrophil. So we see the cell membrane, right? And the cytoplasm. And this dark area is the nucleus. And notice how the nucleus here is a different shape than the nucleus here. That's characteristic of these types of cells. So this is a white blood cell of the same type. And then this one's different. And I'm going to move over to this picture because it makes it a little easier to see. But there's a very small lighter blue around the edge of this cell. That's the cytoplasm. Look how big the nucleus is in this cell compared to the cell as a whole. There's very little cytoplasm and a big nucleus. So that's ways we can identify different types of white blood cells, and they have different functions. There's one more thing in here that you have to notice, and those are these little tiny things. They kind of look like they're junk on the slide. And those are part of our clotting mechanism. So if you cut your finger, you depend on these little guys to stop up that broken blood vessel. Okay, that's the first thing that's going to happen. They're the first part of our clotting mechanism. And those are also made in our bone marrow. And we consider this part of our blood. So these are called platelets, like a plate you'd eat off, platelets. So platelets are for clotting, and we have our oxygen carrying cells, the red blood cells, and then we have cells that fight infection, our white blood cells. I would anticipate that you could identify any of those in a blood smear. And I would expect that. So make sure that you actually not only know that this is blood, but that you know the different components and could identify them. All right. So that is blood, but back to why this is a connective tissue, because we've seen the cells now and there's no matrix really. Well, there actually is, because the cells are in a fluid, and that fluid is called plasma. And plasma carries proteins, and it carries enzymes and hormones. And so there actually is a matrix. It's just not really visible to us because it's more like a fluid. Okay. It's sort of like, well, we've talked about IVs and putting in IVs and how our cells, we need to make sure that our plasma has an equal solute concentration as our cells, right? So that we don't burst our cells or we don't shrink our cells. So plasma isn't really like water. It has a lot of dissolved things in it, but that would be our matrix for blood. Our third type of tissue is called muscle tissue. And muscle tissue has basically one job. Whether you're any of the three types of muscle tissue, your job is to contract. Okay, that's your job. So you're going to contract, and contraction is going to cause the shortening of the muscle. That's all you do, is you shorten the muscle. That allows us to move our entire body. It allows our blood to move around our body. It allows our digestive system to move food from our mouth into our stomach. All of that is possible by muscle. So we have three types of muscle, and we tell muscle apart when we have to identify it by when you look at it, is it striped or not? Striated means striped. So does it have stripes? We have, of our three different types of muscle tissue, two of them are striped and one of them is not. Okay, so that would be the first thing I would look for if I wanted to identify on a microscope slide a type of muscle. Is it striated? Does it have stripes? But then something else to consider, and you won't see this on a slide, is whether that muscle is voluntary, meaning I want to raise my hand and I can do that, right? That's a voluntary movement. I'm waving, I'm writing. Those are all voluntary movements. Skeletal muscle is the only type of muscle that allows that voluntary movement. The other two are controlled by our brain. The brain tells the muscle what to do. One is smooth muscle, and smooth muscle is involuntary, and we would find smooth muscle around the esophagus. And that smooth muscle around the esophagus is going to allow us to swallow. And it's a muscular contraction around the esophagus that's going to move the food down into our stomach. And it's actually going to be in our entire digestive tract, and it's going to move the food along. Okay, so that's an example of smooth muscle. And we don't have to stop and think, okay, I've got to get that food down into my stomach, okay, right? So it's involuntary. Another type of muscle is cardiac muscle, and we're very thankful that that is involuntary, right? We go to bed at night and we wake up in the morning, we certainly hope, right? And our heart has worked all night long for us. So these are what the three different types of tissue look like. And to look right at them, you look at it and say, wow, those look completely different. But how is this striped thing coming into play? Well, first of all, when we talk about striated and stripes, as we look at this, it's easy to see stripes here, but those are not the stripes we're looking for. In either of these top two, they are considered striated. But the stripes we're looking for are not going horizontally. We're looking for vertical stripes. And it's very hard to see. I can see it best right through here, where I can see little vertical stripes. But you can see well in this drawing. And these are the striated, the stripes that we're talking about, is not going horizontally, but the ones going vertically. And that can be very hard to see. But notice in here that it's a little easier to see. So we see a lot of vertical stripes going through this picture. All right. And so that is an example of striated. So both of these are striated. This one is not. And looking back on the page before, our smooth muscle was muscle that is non-striated. So don't be confused by the horizontal stripes. We're talking about vertical stripes. So this smooth muscle to me looks an awful lot like dense connective tissue, right? Remember I said there was another one that I would not ask you. I will not ask you to identify smooth muscle or dense connective tissue. All right? I will not ask you to do that because I find they look very similar, and that's why. But I would ask you to identify either skeletal muscle, our voluntary muscle, and our cardiac muscle. Both of them have stripes, but you can see they look very different. If you can see that they have stripes and you're wondering which one is which, look at this and look at these very prominent stripes. Those are called intercalated discs, and intercalated discs allow the different cells in the heart to talk to one another. And that's really important. And we'll see that when we get to the cardiovascular system, that allows our heart to work in unison, right? We want it to all work together. So these are intercalated discs, these more prominent features. Okay, so that's what you would be looking for in the case of cardiac muscle. You could tell these apart pretty well, I would think. So far, everything I've given you really doesn't look a lot like anything else other than the smooth muscle and the dense connective tissue. And then we have our last tissue. And although there is more than just a neuron, neuron is really kind of the major workhorse of the brain and the spinal cord, and it makes up our nerves. So the neuron is kind of the star of the nervous tissue, and most all the rest of the cells that are found in nervous tissue are there to help out the neuron, to support the neuron. So we're just going to cover the neuron today. When we get into the nervous system, we'll talk a little bit more about the other parts. But what we're seeing here is a microscopic view of a neuron. We also have a model of a neuron, so you'll be able to see it a little bigger. But remember that every cell has a cell body, and this is an unusually shaped cell, as you can see. So this would be pretty easy to identify, I would think. And so we have this entire cell body. This is the main part of the cell, and here's the nucleus. But the neuron is responsible for carrying messages around the body. And so in order to get the message from other locations, let's say from your hand, right? You're feeling pressure or you're feeling pain. That little sensor in your finger is going to send a message. These are called dendrites, and dendrites are going to carry the message from another area down into the cell body. And maybe that dendrite, because they stick out in different areas around the cell, they can pick up different stimuli. So that stimulus comes into the cell body, and that message is kind of coalesced. And that message then goes out this, and it's a little bit bigger projection, and it's called an axon. And an axon is going to take the message away from the cell body, whereas the dendrites are going to bring the message into the cell body. And we'll see a model of that as well. I think that does it for that. let's watch. What did I do with those? There we go. All right. So let's look at the different types of models, and then we'll talk a little bit more. So I do want to stop this. Somebody showed me how to do this. I can't remember when, but I want to share my screen and I want to share computer sound. Are there any questions before we go on with this about any of the tissues, what their role is and what they would look like? Your book will go, as we've gone through, you've probably noticed your book goes through a little bit more detail associated with that, but
Did you explain the term that connects the bones?
I will actually ask me again after we see the knee model.
All right.
All right, because I will talk about it there.
Okay.
But we're going to start with the skin model. Okay, this is a skin model. And the skin model, actually, this model in particular shows 3 different sections of skin on the body. This one over here has hair, so this is actually the scalp. But this one is the underarm, okay, the armpit. And then this one here is the sole of the foot. And you can actually see that the sole of the foot has a much thicker, what we call
I can't see the
epidermis.
video.
Yeah, I was just about to say.
What? And as you look
We
at
can't see the video.
outlined by this. What are you actually seeing? Because it
blue
says share
section as we
screen.
go across.
Your
A
Word
word.
document.
Oh, I guess I didn't have the right. All right. Gosh, I keep thinking I've got it all figured out. Hang on. So let me stop sharing. Yeah, I bet my Word document was very exciting. All right, I'm sharing computer sound. I was so proud of that computer sound thing too. I'm also going to try to turn off my sound during it and see if you can still hear. So let me know if that does not happen. Okay, this is a skin model. And the skin model, actually, this model in particular shows 3 different sections of skin on the body. This one over here has hair, so this is actually the scalp. But this one is the underarm, okay, the armpit. And then this one here is the sole of the foot. And you can actually see that the sole of the foot has a much thicker, what we call epidermis. And the epidermis is layers of skin. And as you look at the epidermis here, the epidermis is outlined by this blue section as we go across in each of the areas of the body. But we've also then underneath the epi means the top layer, underneath the epidermis, we have a dermis layer, which is going to house a lot of the blood vessels and some of the structures that we see here that we'll go over. And then down below where you see all this yellow, that's either subcutaneous, we sometimes call it subcutaneous, and I think your book actually calls it hypodermis. Okay, so these are the 3 layers that we'll look at. The hypodermis, or the subcutaneous tissue, this is all fat. Okay, so all this yellow is meant to represent fat, and that helps insulate you, so it's in a great spot underneath the skin. And when we go up and we move up to the dermis, you can see that we have hair follicles in the dermis. This is a cutaway section of the hair follicle. And then here is a hair follicle, and this is a sebaceous gland. The sebaceous gland is around the hair follicle, and that's going to produce oils. And you know that you have that nice lustrous look in your hair, and after a few days, it's a little less lustrous and a little more greasy. And that's all coming from this sebaceous gland. Next to that here is actually a muscle, and this is a smooth muscle, and the smooth muscle here actually causes the hair to stand on end. You know that is goosebumps, and that's an autonomic response. That means it's an automatic response. You don't think, oh, I'm going to have goosebumps. But when it gets cold, you know that this erector pili muscle will actually contract,
and the hair will stand on end. Next to that, we have a sweat gland. We have two different types of sweat glands on this model. This sweat gland, which is a little less obvious, but we have that in our scalp. And notice we have them on the bottoms of our feet and on our under our armpits. But we also have here is this larger sweat gland, and that's a little bit different type of sweat gland, and it produces more sweat. As you probably know, that's why we have deodorant. So as we move along through here, at some points you'll see these little structures, and we can see structures here down in the subcutaneous tissue. We can see structures that go up here into the area right below the epidermis, and those are actually sensors for the nervous system. You know that you can feel pressure and pain on your skin, and so that's where those sensors are. If we look just at the epidermal layer, it's the very top layer. We know it sloughs off. Okay, we can rub skin off. It's got keratin to protect us and make sure that we don't take on water when we get in the bath or the shower. Okay, it's kind of a protective coating. But as we look over here where there's a cutaway, we're going to see that these are called papillae. And the papillae are actually in the dermis, but they project up into the epidermis. And they actually function to kind of secure the epidermis and to take these little, either whether they're pressure or pain sensors, and get them close to the surface in the epidermis.
Couldn't get my thing to unmute. Any questions about the skin model before I go to the bone? All right.
Hi, this is a bone model, and the bone model actually shows what's called an osteon, and that's kind of a unit of bone that contains cells. But it also contains the matrix. Remember, when we're talking about connective tissue, we talk about the fact that there's both cells and matrix, and that's some sort of substance besides the cells. So as we look at this osteon, first of all, you'll notice that there's concentric circles around the center. This is called the central canal, and the circles around the center are called the lamella. And in the central canal, you see actually a nerve, and you see blood supply. So vein and artery both run through each osteon. That's why when you break a bone, it's incredibly painful. You've got nerve in there, but it also will repair, even though there's a lot of this lamella, which is made of calcium and phosphorus and some collagen in there. It will still repair quickly compared to something like a tendon or a ligament that has less blood supply. So we have the central canal, the lamella, and you can also see here, better in color here, there's a red spot, and the red spot is called the lacuna. And the lacuna houses the osteocyte, which is the cell that makes the bone. So osteocyte is inside lacuna. And in addition, through the lamella, you can see what are called canaliculi, and those are a way for the lamella to talk to one another, or the cells to talk to one another. I think that does it.
Any questions about that one? All right, on to the next one.
This is the neuron model, and a neuron is a type of cell that transfers messages. It's part of the nervous system and the spinal cord, as well as the peripheral system. So the parts of the neuron are the dendrites, which are going to receive messages from other neurons and from sensory receptors in the area of the dendrites. And they're going to pass the message on to the cell body. And the cell body is this, and you can see the cell body also has the nucleus in it. You should recognize the rough endoplasmic reticulum, the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. We've got some mitochondria in here as well, the Golgi apparatus. So those should all be familiar to you. Those are located within the cell body. And then each neuron has what's called an axon, and the axon is going to send the message on either to another neuron, or it may send it to a muscle or a nerve. In each case, that message has to travel through this axon, and this big piece on it, which is broken down here so you can see it, the blue is actually the axon, where this insulation here is called the myelin sheath. And the myelin sheath is like an insulator on a wire, and it's meant to protect the integrity of the message as it moves along. And there is a disease that probably all of you are aware of called multiple sclerosis, that actually is the degradation at certain points of this myelin sheath, and that can impact the integrity of the message.
Good with that one? All right, this is the last one, and this is on the knee.
This is a model of the knee, and what I want to show you here is the bones that make up the knee joint. So this bone is actually the femur, that's the largest bone in the body, and then down below here is the tibia, and right next to it, although it's attached here, is a separate bone called the fibula. So as you look at this, we're going to show you probably what some of you have had surgery on before or have damaged. We're going to show you some area within the knee joint. And the knee is actually really interesting because it's composed of a number of different tissues, which is why we show it during this lab. So first of all, most of you know that this is the patella. That's that little floating kind of bone in front of the knee. And as you look in between the femur and the tibia, you'll see that there's this kind of lighter colored structure. This is called the meniscus, and some of you have probably had injuries to your meniscus before. So this is where the meniscus is, and it provides cushioning between those two bones. And in addition, I'm going to turn this over. And what you're going to see now, you're looking at the back of the knee. And the back of the knee has the cruciate ligaments. There's both the posterior cruciate ligament and the anterior cruciate ligament. And so as you look at this, the posterior is the one that you can see well. Behind that, and I'm going to turn back over, you can see it a little bit here, but I'm going to turn the model back over and remove the patella again. And I'm going to bend the knee, and that is the anterior cruciate ligament that people frequently in sporting events, for example, will tear and require surgery. So that's the one. And remember that a ligament is an attachment that goes from bone to bone, whereas a tendon is an attachment that goes from a muscle to a bone. So I always think of it, when I think of the ligament, as the ACL, which is the anterior cruciate ligament, is what gets torn, and for some reason the attachment on bone to bone seems to me to be more tenuous. So I kind of remember it that way, but you'll have to find your own way to remember the definition of a tendon and a bone. So that's the knee joint.
All right, so that covers did that answer your question, you Carrie, before I go further?
Yeah, is it the meniscus, right?
The meniscus?
Meniscus. That's
The-
that's how the bones connect.
That's what cushions the bones. What happens is bones connect to one another with tendon or with ligaments. Bone to bone is ligament. But then, but bone to muscle, both of them are supportive, and bone to muscle are tendons. So we have both tendons and ligaments that are dense connective tissue, but ligaments are defined as dense connective tissue that attaches bones to one another. That's ligaments, and tendons attach a muscle to a bone.
Also, like, I don't know if that's gonna be on the test. I just want to know about that liquid between the bones. Like, is it true? Like, there's a liquid.
Yep.
Yeah.
There's what are called bursa, and there's actually a number of bursa in the knee. And bursa are little fluid-filled sacs. And those fluid-filled sacs, usually people know that they have, know about them because they have a problem with them. Either they become infected or they fill with fluid for some reason for an injury, and that is painful, as you can imagine, if there's more fluid in that sac than is meant to be there. Or even sometimes you can actually have them break. But I don't know if any of you have ever dealt with bursitis. You may have heard of bursitis, and oftentimes you're talking in bursitis about the inflammation of those bursa, and they're sore. Oftentimes they're associated with repetitive movements. So.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. As far as the summary questions, if you look on page 107, we've already been over what you need to hand in. But as far as the summary questions, you can take off number 2. Okay. I didn't like that question, so we're taking it off. Other than that, I think you can also take off number 4. I didn't explain that when we went through it. So you can take off questions 2 and 4. All right, I'm done with you for today unless you have questions. But if you're welcome to stay and work on your questions or your video quiz. Don't forget your video quiz, right? Because you have to watch the video to do it. But I'm good. Any questions?
For the photo upload, that's for in the microscope, right?
Yep.
We have to do them all on
Nope.
page.
Nope.
Sorry?
You have to look at them, but then you pick only one to photo upload.
Oh, okay. Okay.
All right. If there's no questions, you're free to go. Have a good day, you guys. Enjoy the warmth.
Thank you, you too.
Thank
Thank
you. Have a
you.
good day.